Well, folks, you know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast. Thanks for joining us here on Monday nights. We record these while we're playing in the nightly home game over on PokerStars, trying to steal each other's chips. If you don't know what Rec Poker is about, I guess I should introduce us. We are a largely volunteer-based organization. We're recreational, thoughtful, amateur poker players who just love having fun with this game of poker. We study together, we learn together, we learn from each other's mistakes, we celebrate together. We have a great time doing it, and you can get a free account by heading over to rec.poker today. All it takes is an email address and a smile. But we insist on both. I have to thank our sponsors, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. And I have to thank the Wrecking Crew, because we couldn't do a dang thing over here if it wasn't for the men and women who pour their hearts into what we do at Rec Poker. No one does that with more fervor and enthusiasm than the Wrecking Crew. It takes a crew. And if you want to find out more about me and the rest of the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew. But listen up, because you're going to meet a few of them right here tonight.
I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the PokerStars home game.
I'm Kim Kilroy, PatBat33, most places, Fergie56 in the home game.
I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Radman50 just about everywhere.
I'm Taylor Mass. I'm at Taylor_Mass on Twitter, and Gopherboy TJM in the home game.
And the Wrecking Crew, like I say, they are very active participants in all of our learning material, the study groups, the book studies, the strategy discussions, the play and hangs. These are the people that make all the magic happen. But the other people that we depend on so immensely are our premium members. One of the perks of being a premium member is that you get to jump in here on the forums editions of the podcast every week. This week, we've got Eric Anderson in the house. Regular listeners will be very familiar with Eric. He's a prolific poster in the forums and an insightful guy who has been sharing his thoughts on various poker subjects in our study groups along as we go, including the book study, which is something we're going to talk about today. But Eric, thanks for joining us on the show. Why don't you tell folks where they can find you in the home game?
Hi, I'm E. Anderson85 at rec.poker and in the home game.
Right on. Well, thanks for joining us, Eric. We are going to be looking at a post tonight from Rob Washam that sort of I'm going to take you guys behind the curtain a little bit into the book study. So we run the book study here, Rob's. I've been doing this for quite a while now. We take all sorts of great poker books and we review them together under Rob's guidance. He puts together these slides chapter by chapter. He leads these conversations that we have every 2 weeks. And he also runs the forum where we get to share a lot of cool files and images and charts and databases and that kind of stuff that help us really get to the bottom of what we're studying each month in the book study. So, Rob, you put up a post today. We're doing the Poker Brain by Matt Matros, and you put up a post just before the new year talking about constructing our range into buckets. And you put an awesome spreadsheet together. And this post really elicited a lot of response from people like Chris and Eric and some other people that have been taking part in the book study. Can you just talk a little bit about what this means to have different buckets for our hands, why it's important, and kind of what this exercise was like for you? And you are in Somsky mode right now, which is our way of saying that people are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, we were going through optimal play concept 2 in the Poker Brain our last session, and there was we brought up the term that Matt Matros brought up called buckets, and it's not a unique concept. I mean, we talked about that a little bit in modern poker theory. We talked about equity buckets. So it's the same type of thing. And in this concept here, we're talking about all the hands in your range can be put into different buckets. So there's buckets of hands that you're going to play exactly the same way, regardless of the circumstances, let's say. So when you see a specific flop, there's going to be a group of hands in your range that you're going to play a certain way. Another group of hands you're going to play a different way. So let's just, and I use it just a quick example. And for one thing, in this example, I am not saying that this is the way you should play these hands. I just took a range and I just randomized a flop. And then I took all the hands in that range. I'm in position. I'm under the gun. I've raised pre-flop and I get called by the big blind with a 60 big blind stack. I used the standard GTO range for my starting range. And then I just said, okay, and I'm going to be checked to, pretty much the big blind's always going to check to me. So what hands do I bet and fold to a raise? That's one bucket of hands. So all these hands, I would play the same way. And then here's a range of hands that I would bet and call a check raise. And what does that group of hands look like? So that's a bucket, another bucket. There's another bucket, which is a bet re-raise. So here's a bucket of hands that I'm going to bet. And if I get check raised, I'm going to re-raise him. And then there's hands that I'm going to check. And then how do those hands relate to the flop? And when do I check them? When do I bet them? When do I bet raise? And have an idea before I perform my action, whether it's bet or check, I have an idea of how all these hands are going to fit in all of those different buckets.
Yeah, that's the real key, it seems, Rob, is for each decision point that you're going to be faced, having an idea, just kind of like looking down the road a little bit so that you can anticipate, because you get to this point with your entire range of hands that open from that position pre-flop. So you've got a pretty wide range at this point. And then you're just kind of deciding in advance, what am I planning to do with the different parts of this range? And so you put them into buckets. So I like this idea of there's only so many buckets that you could need according to any given spot. And you lay it out here. When you're checked to, there's the hands that you can check behind or the hands that you can bet. Those are your only options available to you. If you check behind, that's the end of the decision point. Now you get a turn, you get new information. Now you have to start thinking about a new starting range and the new buckets that you might introduce at this point. And then when the part of your range that bets, and I think this is the spot that people get, I don't want to say they're not lazy. They're just not thinking far enough ahead to anticipate, well, sometimes when I bet, they're going to raise me. And how are the different parts of my range going to respond to that raise? And if you don't have an idea in your mind already, then you can get put into an uncomfortable position because, people say this all the time. It's like, I made the bet and then he raised me. I'm like, what do I do now? Like, well, that's something you should have thought about when you made your bet, because it's one of the very predictable outcomes that's available to our opponent. So Rob, is that the basic concept that we're talking about here?
That's basically what Matt Matros is using as a way of the optimal play concept number 2 is called think ahead. And so the way you think ahead is by taking your entire range and breaking it into these buckets so that you can anticipate what you're going to do with those specific set of hands. And the key again is, I think a lot of people think in terms of their hand. What am I going to do with this hand? When in reality, you need to be thinking about what you're going to do with your entire range. And then there's a range within the range that you're going to play in the same manner. So by doing that, you make yourself less predictable than you would if you weren't taking this approach.
And so how do we, and I'll open this up to the entire panel. So like Chris, you responded here and you kind of listed out the different hand combinations that you might put in the different buckets here. I think people kind of understand intuitively, well, my very strongest hands, I'm going to play for value, and I might raise if they might, re-raise if they raise, or I might decide to trap based on the board. At their weakest hands, they're probably going to fold or check behind. How can we kind of decide what to do with some of those middle hands, and like how important is it to have a certain number of them in each bucket? Do we need a bucket for each one of these and that kind of thing? Chris, when you were looking at these particular hand combos, how did you decide which ones to put in which buckets?
Well, I've been trying to do, I mean, I guess I would almost even challenge the assumption you just made there. I've been trying to do a lot of work with, and this has been changing the way I think about these spots, but kind of the idea of reverse hierarchy. So that like on the example that we were given was an 8-high flop. It was a flop. So in this under the gun opens, big blind calls, the flop was, I forget what the suits were.
8 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 4 of spades looks
right,
like. If I
right. So it's a low flop. It's a 2-tone flop. It's 8-high. And so one way to think about a flop like that is, number one, it's fairly, even though we as the under the gun opener have a lot of like big pairs and lovely things like that, this is a fairly friendly or advantageous flop for the big blind. So that what that means to me is that we as the in position player need to have a more expanded checking range. That we need, and that checking range needs to include some strong hands. Well, okay, which strong hands? And this is where that idea of reverse hierarchy. Well, a hand like basically 9s through aces. Let's take all our over pairs, right? A hand like aces needs no protection at this point, right? Like you cannot there's no overcard to the aces. Kings need less, or need a little bit more, but the only card they fear is an ace, really, right? If they're not already losing. And so those are the, like, aces and kings become really attractive checkbacks here to protect the strength of our checking range, while hands like 9s and 10s become very attractive bets because they're vulnerable to those overcards coming. Does that sort of make sense? And so thinking about, and then you can think about it all, that's just the overpair segment. You can think about other types of hand classes and think about how do we manufacture this so that our checking range has some of the garbage in it, but also has some strength in it as well.
And that's kind of like what Rob was talking about not being predictable, right? About having kind of some balance in those ranges as well. And Chris, my only other question to follow up on that a little bit is, so when you're thinking about that, do you think about like having a certain ratio of bluffs to value? Is it a question of having like the same number of combos, or like a 2-to-1 ratio or something like that? How do you decide which ones to include and which ones to put in a different bucket?
Yeah, I mean, we should, the more aggressive actions that we take, the more those, should start to weight towards value. We still need bluffs in those ranges, but we need to weight them. The more aggressive we get, the more, like if we're re-raising a raise and that kind of thing, that needs to start to weight more towards value, because it's going to narrow our opponent's range as well. Was that your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Another thing to think about in making up that ratio, I guess you could say, is the size of your continuation bet. Will have a lot to do with the ratio of value to bluffs that you should have in your range. And that's funny because we talked about that in optimal place concept number 1. We talked about, or just right at the beginning of the book, we talked about what are your bluffing ratios based on the bet size. And we have actually a post in there about that too, that I think Garrick put some stuff out there on that too. So this is some of the major concepts that we've been talking about each month. We've been kind of throwing some stuff out there on the forums. And so, yeah, I think the bet size is the most important consideration when you're determining how much value to bluffs you should have in each of those buckets.
That's a great point. and also, and we can take the same process and use it in a completely different part of the game too. Like pre-flop, there's a lot of opportunities to think about different buckets. When you're in a situation where, let's say, you're opening the pot from middle position or late position, you have a full range of hands that you're going to take that opening raise action with. And then, just like in this situation, you should have already in mind an expectation of, okay, if I get 3-bet from someone from the blinds, for instance, here's some of the hands I'm going to fold. Here's some of the hands I'm going to call. Here's some of the hands I'm going to 4-bet with. And the hands that are in those buckets might change depending on, okay, am I in position or am I out of position? Who is the opponent? What are the stack sizes? Where are we in the tournament? But the buckets remain. You're still going to have those options available to you. And when you make that opening raise, you should really be thinking about where are these hands going to go? Every hand in your range has to go into one of these buckets eventually. So thinking ahead a little bit can save you that uncomfortable moment where you're facing a raise and you're like, oh, I don't know. I have no idea what to do with this exact combination of hands that I see in front of me right now. Eric, did you have a comment there?
It just kind of goes with look to your left. If I'm going to raise this 7-6 suited, I look to my left and this guy's 3-betting every hand. Maybe I'll call with 7-6 suited, maybe not, but I know what I'm getting into when I know he's going to 3-bet me. And another thing about the buckets, the easiest way I understand the buckets is just looking at a solver output. We've been trained to do these 1/3 pot bets, 2/3 pot bets, fold, and all in. Those are 4 buckets right there, just for our opening range. And then we go on to the flop, and we have 4 more buckets. But just look one card ahead. If I'm going to open this hand, what does my flop solver output look like?
Yeah, I like that. That reminds me of a comment that Nate Mavis would make on the Thinking Poker podcast from time to time when he was sort of deciding what action to take next. Because Rob made this really good point about the ratio of bluffs to value hands in your range having to do a lot with the size of the bet that you're making. And you might find yourself in a spot in a game of poker and know that to put the right amount of pressure on your opponent, you need to use a bet size or a raise size of X. And if you're going to do that, then here are the range of hands that would be profitable to include in that range. And then you look down at your hand, you're like, okay, well, is my hand one of those hands? Because if it's not, then it's actually, you're not, maybe you need to think about putting it in a different bucket right off the beginning. You don't actually have to have a range for every action. You can also say, like, I'm just not going to have a range of hands here that opens and folds to a 3-bet because I only have 8 big blinds. So I'm only ever going to have hands that I'm only going to open and fold, or I'm going to open and shove, and I don't even need to come up with a bucket for some of those other scenarios. And we see this when we're given the opportunity to open the pot. We could limp, but usually we don't create a bucket for that. We just kind of put all our playing hands in an open raising hand bucket, as it were, an open raising range. So it's not like you have to have every root, every branch of the decision tree covered, but every hand that you choose to play, you should know what's going to happen to it down those different branches. You should have a plan for what's coming, what the different options will be. Rob, do you want to send us off with any other?
I think what Eric said is really an interesting way of looking at it, because he talked about understanding how the solvers would play that range, which should inform you as to what buckets those hands belong in. And I believe what Matt Matros is doing here in the Poker Brain is trying to get us to think like a solver when we're doing these things, because that's really what a solver is doing, is putting all your hands in your range into different buckets. They're going to, you're going to raise, or you're going to c-bet 70% of the time with this hand, and there's like 8 hands that are all the same. And then you're going to check 20% of the time. And so the solvers have those frequencies already solved. And what Matt is trying to do is trying to get our brain to think like that, so that we're thinking in buckets like a solver would think. So I think what Eric said was very, very intuitive, that's what we're trying to do here.
Chris?
Can I just, and the thing that I think is important, because I hear that, like, well, why would I need to think like that? Like, why, I have pocket nines right now. I don't have pocket aces. So why does it matter how I would play pocket aces when I have pocket nines? And there's an 8 high flop. I've got an overpair and I've got pocket nines. I'm just going to play my pocket nines how I want to play my pocket nines here, right? And like, why does it matter how I play these other hands? But it does actually matter, because if you don't have a sense of how you would play all those other hands, it's hard to represent them, and it's hard to think about how you're representing them when you're getting to later streets. How would you play if maybe the aces and nines isn't a good example, but if a jack comes, right, that's going to change the dynamic of which hand is scared of that jack, right? The nines are and the aces aren't, probably. But like, if you're not thinking about that across all the hands that you might be playing, now you're just reacting and you're playing the hand that you have in front of you rather than trying to construct something that tells a good story to your opponent, right? That's what we're really trying to do, and puts them in a position of not being able to say, I see. When the jack came, you got nervous, so you checked back when you were betting before. I can put you on something here. And if we have more of it may not be the best example, but if we have more of a sense of how our entire range might play across these kinds of segments, we can have a better sense of how to play that exact hand that we have in the moment.
Yeah, Eric?
Our job is to put our opponents in tough situations and make them make mistakes. Pretend that all I ever raise is pocket aces. You're going to learn really quick that when I raise, that I have pocket aces.
Yep.
The only way I'm going to get you to call is to have something you can beat in my range. So I might put ace 5 suited along with my pocket aces, and then that gives you a reason to call. You might think, I can beat your ace 5 suited with my ace 6 suited, and then I still can beat you with my aces. And then you just balance that with your bet size that we covered in chapter 1 of this book. But it's important to have a bucket that has both value and bluffs in it. And it's easier to do that off the table and kind of think about it before you're in the situation where you have pocket nines and the jack hits the board. What do you do then?
Yeah, and I think I like what Eric said earlier about sort of thinking about it like a solver. It's not like we need to have an infinite number of buckets, but if you set up a solver, usually the way it works is you'll give it 3 sizes, or you'll give it the ability to check or to bet in 2 different sizes. Those are buckets. That's basically what we're doing. We're saying, okay, so pick some hands that you're going to check with, some hands that you're going to bet 1/3 pot, and some hands that you're going to bet pot. And the solver just goes through and, sorts the hands that it's the most EV to be in these different buckets according to the qualities of that hand. If you gave it 3 bet sizes, it might spread them out over 3 bet sizes. If you only gave it 1 bet size, it might say, okay, well, I'm going to check with these and I'm going to bet with these. That's exactly what we should just be doing ourselves in our minds. It really just comes down to how many different responses do we want to have to any particular decision point, and which hands should go in each of those ranges, in each of the ranges of those responses. So that's really all it comes down to. It's just kind of like mapping out the game tree a little bit and thinking about the very circumstances that will come up. And that makes a big difference. And I think I like what Eric said too here. It has to happen off the felt, because you don't have to have all this stuff solved before you get to the table, but you need to have the rough idea figured out so that when you get to the table, you can actually really just pay attention to the hand in your hand, because you've got a lot of that other stuff kind of happening automatically in the background. And you don't need to, in the moment, figure out exactly how you'd play every combination of hands that you could have there. But knowing how your range is going to be expressed through these different decision points, it'll make it easier. You'll be more confident. You won't give off as much information. You'll be less predictable to play against. And those are all good qualities when it comes to winning poker tournaments and cash games. Well, any other thoughts here, folks? That was a really good conversation. If you want to learn a lot more about this, come join the book study with Rob. It's every 2 weeks on the first and third Wednesday of the month. And even if it's too late to get in on the ground floor of The Poker Brain by Matt Matros, we're going to be doing a new book in the spring. And all the sessions are recorded and they're in the archives here at Rec Poker. And you can also go into the group discussion area in the forums here and look at all the old slides, a lot of the forum posts and comments, the spreadsheets and images and documents and things that the members have put up there to help share their ideas as we explore this material. So do go check it out. If you want to try Rec Poker, your first month is only $5 if you use the code Rec Poker at sign up. And after that, it's $15 a month, and it makes a big difference to us. And I think Eric Anderson will tell you it gives you access to a lot of this other training material out there that you just can't get as a community member. So we got a thumbs up from Eric there. Thank you, man. And I guess without further ado, I want to thank all our premium members for their support. And of course, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, without whom we couldn't do what we do. Everyone on the Wrecking Crew who puts their time in here every month, every week, every day here. But mostly you, the listeners, because we do it all for you. So thanks for sharing. Thanks for having fun. And we'll see you next week.